15. Back to the future.
回到未来，
The return of U.S.-style capitalism.
美式资本主义的回归，
Recession ended MOF dominance.
经济衰退结束了财务省的统治。
In the late 1980s, the bright, powerful bureaucrats at the Okurassho had been considered a dream catch for any Japanese bride. The man who could introduce himself with a business card, or meisure, from the renowned finance ministry elicited deep bows and hushed exclamations of awe and respect, not only from potential in-laws but also from society at large. But times have changed for the MOF men. Scandals have rocked the ministry. In early 1998, public prosecutors for the first time actually raided the most powerful of Japan's ministries. Frequent demonstrations have been held outside the ministry's doors by citizens disgusted by the bureaucrats' actions. Several senior bureaucrats have been arrested in the past few years, and several have committed suicide. In January 2001, the Okurassho was abolished. The remaining rump is a far cry from the powerful institution that it had been for over half a century.
在1980年代末，大藏省的明亮、强大的官僚们曾被视为任何日本新娘的梦想捕获。能够用来自著名的财务部的名片或名片介绍自己的男人，不仅从潜在的姻亲，而且从社会大众那里引起了深深的鞠躬和低声的敬畏和尊重的赞叹。但是，财务部的男人们的时代已经改变，丑闻震动了这个部门。在1998年初，公诉人首次实际上突袭了日本最强大的部门。公民们对官僚的行为感到厌恶，因此在部门的门外举行了频繁的示威活动。过去几年中，已经逮捕了几位高级官僚，还有几位自杀了。2001年1月，大藏省被废除，剩下的残余远远不及它半个多世纪以来一直是的强大机构。
As a result of the long recession and crisis of the 1990s, the princes of the Bank of Japan won their decades-old war with the Ministry of Finance once and for all. Since all traditional policies to revive the performance of the old system seemed to fail, the system itself was blamed. A number of commentators, initially from abroad, later homegrown, claimed that Japan's troubles were due to the fact that Japan did not follow the free market model. To them, it was no wonder Japan was in recession, what with powerful bureaucrats setting a plethora of regulations and maintaining a cartelized and closed domestic economy, companies ignoring the demands of shareholders for profitability. Frozen labor market structures with lifetime employment, a corporate sector burdened with debt. To neoclassical economists, the real surprise was that the Japanese system had not collapsed earlier. As the symbol of the old economy, MOF was blamed for the lost decade, the escalating fiscal crisis, as well as the creation of the bubble. It was accused of incompetence and, worse, corruption.
由于1990年代的长期经济衰退和危机，日本银行的王子们一劳永逸地赢得了他们与财务部的几十年战争。由于所有传统的政策似乎都无法恢复旧制度的表现，因此人们指责制度本身。一些评论员最初是从国外，后来是本土的，声称日本的困境是因为日本没有遵循自由市场模式。他们认为，日本陷入衰退并不奇怪，因为强大的官僚制定了大量的规定，并维持了一个卡特尔化和封闭的国内经济。公司忽视了股东对盈利的要求，劳动力市场结构冻结，终身就业，企业部门负债累累。对新古典经济学家来说，真正令人惊讶的是，日本的制度没有早些崩溃。作为旧经济的象征，财务部被指责为失去的10年、不断升级的财政危机以及泡沫的创造。他被指责为无能，更糟糕的是腐败。
As a result, MOF had no more standing to defend itself. It fell prey to politicians eager to gain credibility by bashing the best scapegoat about, the ministry. By late 1996, MOF had lost the battle for regulation policy, having to concede a full-blown deregulation of the financial sector, known as the Big Bang. This abolished the license system, one of MOF's main power bases. By early 1997, MOF had lost the battle again, this time for supervision over the banking system. It was decided that beginning in June 1998, this task would be handed over to an independent financial supervisory authority. In a previously unthinkable move, MOF's Banking Bureau and Securities Bureau were abolished. The new FSA began business with a vengeance in June 1998, closing 2 amicutary banks, LTCB and NCB. By late 1997, MOF had also lost the battle for political initiative, so that since then all decisions on fiscal and regulatory policy have been made by LDP politicians.
结果，财务部再也没有立场为自己辩护，它成为了政客们渴望通过抨击最好的替罪羊来获得信誉的猎物。到1996年底，财务部在监管政策的战斗中输了，不得不承认金融部门的全面放松被称为大爆炸。这废除了许可制度，这是财务部的主要权力基础之一。到1997年初，财务部再次输掉了战斗，这次是对银行系统的监督。决定从1998年6月开始，这项任务将交给一个独立的金融监管机构。在此前不可思议的举动中，财务部的银行局和证券局被废除。新的金融监管机构于1998年6月开始大干一场，关闭了2家天下银行 LTCB 和 NCB。到1997年底，财务部也输掉了政治倡议的战斗，因此从那时起，所有关于财政和监管政策的决定都由自由民主党的政治家做出。
Most importantly, MOF had lost the battle for the key control lever, monetary policy and oversight of the Bank of Japan. In June 1997, a revised Bank of Japan law was passed, which became effective in April 1998. This finally gave the Bank of Japan what it had been struggling to gain for half a century, independence from MOF, and, for good measure, from anyone else. More on this in Chapter 18.
最重要的是，财务部在关键控制感、货币政策和对日本银行的监督的战斗中输了。1997年6月，修订后的日本银行法被通过，该法于1998年4月生效。这最终给了日本银行它一直在努力获得的东西，半个世纪以来从财务部获得的独立，以及从任何其他人那里获得的好处。在第18章中有更多关于这个的内容。
What if the Bank of Japan is right?
如果日本银行是对的呢？
But we have found that the princes pursued goals much grander than just breaking up the ministry and becoming legally independent. Their goal has been the structural transformation of Japan's economy. While it is one thing to criticize the way they may have pursued this goal, what if the ultimate goal, to change Japan's economic structure, was not so bad after all, and perhaps in the long-term interest of Japan and the rest of the world? And if, as is quite possible, their particular monetary policies were the only way to implement this structural reform, then perhaps the central bankers have been doing the right thing all along. Certainly the press, especially the foreign press, though by the late 1990s increasingly aware of the use of monetary policy to implement structural change, seems to approve and expresses no surprise or shock that Hayami fears that if he loosens policy too quickly, it would remove the pressure for reform. 1.
但我们发现，这些王子们追求的目标远不止打破部门壁垒和法律独立。他们的目标一直是日本经济的结构性转型。虽然批评他们可能追求这个目标的方式是一回事，但如果最终的目标即改变日本的经济结构并不是那么糟糕，甚至可能符合日本和世界其他地方的长期利益呢？如果他们的特定货币政策是实施这种结构改革的唯一方式，那么也许中央银行家一直以来都在做正确的事情。尤其是新闻界，特别是外国新闻界，虽然到了20世纪90年代末，他们越来越意识到货币政策被用来实施结构性变革，但他们似乎并不反对，也没有对素水谦担心如果他过快的放松政策就会消除改革的压力表示惊讶或震惊。
Leading politicians have now also explicitly adopted the old structural reform agenda and seem sympathetic to the idea of creating hardships to facilitate the reform process. The politician whose script could have been written by the princes at the Bank of Japan is the declared reform prime minister, Junichiro Koizumi. At the Geneva summit in July 2001, when asked how he was going to balance cyclical and structural reform policies, Koizumi replied, "I say, no growth without reform. Because we have decided no growth without reform, we cannot postpone reform and take cyclical stimulation policies. Some say recovery comes first, without reforms. But if the economy recovers, the will to reform will disappear. After the elections, I will continue with the plan of no growth without structural reform," italics added. Point 2. It is noticeable that Koizumi did not claim that structural reforms are necessary for a recovery, in terms of economic causation. He had decided to declare no growth without reform, which expresses the Bank of Japan's motto of the 1990s well. It is indeed merely a restatement of a phrase in the Maikawa report, which said that Japan urgently needed to make a historic transformation in its traditional policies on economic management and the nation's lifestyle. There can be no further development for Japan without this transformation.
现在，领导政治家也明确地采纳了旧的结构改革议程，并且似乎对创造困难以促进改革过程的想法表示同情。这位政治家的剧本可能是由日本银行的王子们编写的，他就是宣布改革的首相小泉纯一郎。2001年7月，在日内瓦峰会上，当被问及他如何平衡周期性和结构性改革政策时，小泉回答说：“我说，没有改革就没有增长，因为我们已经决定没有改革就没有增长，我们不能推迟改革并采取周期性刺激政策。”有些人说，先恢复，不需要改革。但如果经济恢复了，改革的意愿就会消失。选举后，我将继续没有结构改革就没有增长的计划。写体部分为原文。值得注意的是，小泉并没有声称结构改革是经济复苏所必须的，这是从经济因果关系的角度来看的。他决定宣布没有改革就没有增长，这很好地表达了日本银行在20世纪90年代的座右铭。这实际上只是对前川报告中的一句话的重述。该报告称，日本迫切需要在其传统的经济管理政策和国民生活方式上进行历史性的转变。没有这种转变，日本就无法进一步发展。
Of course, it is clear that the bad performance of the economy during the 1990s is not a good reason to implement structural changes. During the 1990s, the Bank of Japan has argued that stimulatory monetary policies would be counterproductive to its long-term goal of structural change precisely because they would be effective in achieving their goal of creating a recovery. This, however, recognizes that the economy would respond to cyclical policies and hence admits that the bad performance of the 1990s is not a reason to change Japan's economic structure. In other words, by admitting that a short-term downturn may be necessary to implement structural changes, proponents of structural reform deprive themselves of their main argument for just why structural reform is necessary. The Bank of Japan effectively agrees with many of its critics that the economy, in an unreformed state, could have produced higher growth than has been the case for much of the 1990s. If this is the case, then why does the Bank of Japan want to change Japan's economic structure?
当然，很明显，20世纪90年代经济表现不佳，并不是实施结构变革的好理由。在20世纪90年代，日本银行曾经辩称，刺激性的货币政策会对其长期的结构变革目标产生反作用，因为它们在实现经济复苏的目标上会有效。然而，这承认了经济会对周期性政策做出反应，因此承认20世纪90年代的糟糕表现并不是改变日本经济结构的理由。换句话说，通过承认可能需要短期的经济下滑来实施结构变革，结构改革的支持者剥夺了他们主张结构改革必要性的主要论据。日本银行实际上同意其许多批评者的观点，即在未改革的状态下，经济本可以产生比20世纪90年代大部分时间更高的增长。如果这是事实，那么日本银行为什么要改变日本的经济结构呢？
Could the motivation of Maekawa's 10-year plan justify the Bank of Japan's actions? It argued that in a globalized and internationalized world economy, Japan could not continue its closed, export-oriented economy. It had to open up to the world. Equally importantly, it also argued that changing Japan's economic structure would not only end trade friction, but also raise the standard of living and the quality of life in Japan and boost Japan's economic growth rate. Was this claim just good salesmanship to appease a conservative population that would resist change? Or is there some truth to it?
前川的10年计划的动机能否证明日本银行的行动？他认为，在全球化和国际化的世界经济中，日本不能继续保持其封闭的以出口为导向的经济，它必须向世界开放。同样重要的是，他还认为，改变日本的经济结构不仅会结束贸易摩擦，而且会提高日本的生活水平和生活质量，并提高日本的经济增长率。这个说法只是好的销售手段，用来安抚那些会抵制变革的保守人口吗？还是说它有一些真实性？
Pillars of growth.
增长的支柱。
Japan's post-war modification of the war economy was hooked on success. It needed continued high growth in order to remain viable as a system. As we saw, in Japan's war economy, the profit motive had been replaced by the goal of market share expansion. Shareholders received low dividends but were rewarded by rising share prices, reflecting the reinvested profits. So continued growth was necessary to keep shareholders content. The same applied to managers and employees. In the war economy system, they were motivated by moving up the corporate ladder. Pay scales at large firms began modestly but rose quickly. To keep the promise of lifetime employment and ever-rising salaries, continued high growth was necessary. Finally, high and rising standards of living would appease the population, which had little political say in the system and a lower quality of life than in Europe or America. In other words, the war economy needed high economic growth to satisfy all interest groups.
日本战后对战争经济的修改取决于成功，它需要持续的高增长才能作为一个系统保持可行。正如我们所看到的，在日本的战争经济中，利润动机已经被市场份额扩张的目标所取代。股东收到的股息较低，但是由于利润的再投资，股价上涨，因此他们得到了回报。因此，持续的增长是必要的，以保持股东的满意度。这同样适用于经理和员工。在战争经济体系中，他们的动力来自于在公司阶梯上的上升。大公司的薪酬等级开始时较低，但很快就会上升。为了实现终身雇佣和不断上升的薪水的承诺，持续的高增长是必要的。最后，高而上升的生活水平会安抚那些在系统中没有政治话语权的人口，他们的生活质量比欧洲或美国低。换句话说，战争经济需要高经济增长来满足所有利益群体。
Growth, however, was ultimately based on exports. Although they accounted for less than 15% of GDP in the 1990s, their importance had been larger. Domestic demand had been suppressed and domestic prices kept artificially high to increase savings. The goods that were produced with the overinvestment had to be sold abroad.
然而，增长最终还是基于出口。虽然在1990年代，出口占 GDP 的比例不到 15%， 但它们的重要性曾经更大。国内需求被压制，国内价格被人为地保持在高位，以增加储蓄。过度投资生产出的商品必须销往海外。
Without continued growth, the system was unsustainable and would have to be modified at the very least. The ability to grow fast rested on two pillars. One was a world trade system, read that of the United States, that allowed Japan to eat into everybody else's market share. In exchange for the strategic military benefits, the United States allowed the continuation of the war economy. The second pillar was the ability to constantly allocate new credit to productive sectors. MIDI helped in their identification. Drawing on its advice, the BOJ-Princes allocated credit. Unproductive sectors could not obtain purchasing power. This way, Japan quickly moved up the value-added ladder, from textiles to steel to automobiles to semiconductors and consumer electronics.
如果没有持续的增长，这个系统就无法持续，至少需要进行修改。快速增长的能力依赖于两个支柱，一个是世界贸易体系及美国的体系，它让日本侵蚀了其他所有人的市场份额。为了战略军事利益，美国允许战争经济的持续。第二个支柱是不断向生产性部门分配新的信贷的能力。日本贸易产业省 MITI 在这方面提供了帮助。在其建议的指导下，日本银行的高层分配了信贷，非生产性部门无法获得购买力。这样，日本迅速在增值阶梯上攀升，从纺织业到钢铁业，再到汽车业，最后到半导体和消费电子产品。
Crisis of the Miracle Model.
奇迹模型的危机。
Both pillars of growth started to crumble in the early 1970s. Beginning in the 1980s, when the costs of Japan's export drive became too large for the United States to bear, all U.S. administrations have been demanding that Japan abandon its export orientation and open its markets. With the end of the Cold War, this policy change became much more urgent, as the political and strategic benefits of a strong Japan were also reassessed.
两个增长的支柱在1970年代初开始动摇。从1980年代开始，当日本的出口驱动的成本对美国来说变得过大时，所有的美国政府都要求日本放弃其出口导向，开放其市场。随着冷战的结束，这种政策变化变得更加紧迫，因为强大的日本的政治和战略利益也在重新评估。
Japan could not ignore the foreign cry for change. Suffering from Japan's trade surpluses, the world could close itself off from Japanese imports. For a long time, this threat seemed only theoretical, with Japanese goods having become so dominant in many sectors that a boycott would be unthinkable. However, the creation of trade blocs and strong Asian competitors had changed the equation. Despite skepticism, Europe forged monetary union. North and South America are scheduled to be united in a single free trade zone in 2005, likely to be followed by monetary union some time later. Such large trade blocs could become autarkic, or at least independent from Japanese goods.
日本不能忽视外界对变革的呼声。受日本贸易顺差的影响，世界可能会对日本的进口商品关闭大门。长期以来，这种威胁似乎只是理论上的，因为日本商品在许多领域已经变得如此主导，以至于抵制是不可想象的。然而，贸易集团的建立和强大的亚洲竞争者改变了这个等式。尽管存在怀疑，欧洲还是建立了货币联盟。北美和南美计划在2005年统一为一个单一的自由贸易区，可能在稍后的某个时候跟进货币联盟。这样大的贸易集团可能会变得自给自足，或者至少不依赖日本商品。
The second pillar of growth, the constant upgrading to higher value-added activities, was also showing its age. In the past, all the new high value-added areas, from automobiles in the 1970s to semiconductors in the 1980s, had been within the manufacturing sector. Now Japan had reached the top of the manufacturing value-added pyramid. Despite maximum rationalization and heavy investments, the incremental additional value produced by even the top-end manufacturers was leveling off. The growth potential of manufacturing was diminishing.
第二个增长的支柱即不断升级到更高增值活动，也开始显露出老态。过去，所有新的高增值领域，从1970年代的汽车到1980年代的半导体，都在制造业内。现在，日本已经达到了制造业增值金字塔的顶端。尽管进行了最大限度的合理化和大量投资，即使是顶级制造商产生的增量附加值也在趋于平稳。制造业的增长潜力正在减小。
The main factor inputs that are used in an economy are land, labor, capital, and technology. The war economy system is probably the most efficient at mobilizing these inputs in the shortest possible time and ensuring that they are used for whatever activity is considered high priority. As more and more people joined the labor force, as more land was used productively, as capital investments were increased, and as new technologies continued to be introduced from abroad, economic growth remained high. However, in the 1970s, after decades of high growth, Japan was approaching full employment of these factor inputs.
在经济中使用的主要要素投入包括土地、劳动力、资本和技术。战时经济体系可能是在最短的时间内动员这些投入，并确保它们被用于任何被认为是高优先级的活动的最有效的体系。随着越来越多的人加入劳动力大军，越来越多的土地被有效利用，资本投资增加，以及新技术不断从国外引进，经济增长保持在高位。然而，在1970年代，经过几十年的高速增长，日本正接近这些要素投入的全面就业。
Figure 15.1 Japanese real GDP growth.
图15.1日本实际 GDP 增长。
Source: Economic and Social Research Institute, Cabinet Office, Government of Japan.
来源：经济社会研究所，日本政府内阁办公室。
Worse, the quantity of inputs started declining. The workforce participation had reached a peak and, due to an aging society, was approaching the point where it would fall. Land is fixed, and it was hard to raise its productivity, although decentralization and regionalization would provide an answer. Capital investment had reached a level where any further increases led to diminishing returns. Technological inputs were much harder to come by now that Japan's technology had caught up with that of the world leaders. Instead of copying or licensing, expensive and time-intensive research and development was now needed.
更糟糕的是，投入的数量开始下降，劳动力参与率已经达到顶峰，并且由于社会老龄化，即将到达下降的点。土地是固定的，提高其生产力很困难，尽管分权化和区域化可能提供答案。资本投资已经达到了任何进一步增加都会导致收益递减的水平。现在日本的技术已经赶上了世界领导者，技术投入变得更加困难。 现在需要的是昂贵且耗时的研发，而不是复制或许可。
Japan was running out of inputs. Consequently, the war economy system could not deliver high growth anymore. Beginning in the 1970s, Japan's economic growth rate dropped sharply, while growth averaged 8.7% in the 1950s and 10% in the 1960s. It only clocked up 6% in the 1970s.3, as can be seen in Figure 15.1. Statistically, Japan's growth rate has been on a sharp downward trend since. On the basis of the old reliance of input maximization in the manufacturing sector alone, economic growth would at best stagnate at the 1% level. The old high-growth system had turned into a slow-growth straitjacket. Point 4.
日本的投入正在耗尽，因此战时经济体系无法再提供高增长。从1970年代开始，日本的经济增长率急剧下降。虽然1950年代的增长率平均为 8.7%，1960年代为 10%， 但1970年代只有 6.0%。如图示 5.1 所示，从统计上看，日本的增长率自此以来一直呈急剧下降趋势。仅依赖于制造业的投入最大化，经济增长最好也只能停滞在 1% 的水平。旧的高增长体系已经变成了低增长的束缚。
Not only the mechanics of the mobilized war economy system required continued high growth. Its rapidly aging society also made more than 1% growth necessary. The workforce will begin to contract soon, while the expenditure required for pensions and social welfare will soar. Since Japan had opted for a pay-as-you-go system whose excess revenues were squandered, this will place an enormous burden on a declining base of able-bodied workers. Point 5. There is now more than one pensioner for every 2 welfare contributors. The number of pensioners is rising so fast that drastic cuts in pensions and hefty increases in the contributions would remain insufficient. One suggested solution is to transfer the public pension liabilities to a private system of defined contributions to equity investment funds. But the only way to feed its aging society is to increase Japan's growth rate. If more wealth is generated, there is more to share with the elderly.
不仅动员战时经济体系的机制需要持续的高增长，其迅速老龄化的社会也使得超过 1% 的增长成为必要。劳动力将很快开始减少，而养老金和社会福利所需的支出将激增。由于日本选择了一个过度收入被挥霍的现收现付制度，这将给正在减少的劳动力基础带来巨大的负担。现在每2个福利贡献者中就有1个以上的退休人员。退休人员的数量增长如此之快，以至于大幅削减养老金和大幅增加贡献都是不够的。一个建议的解决方案是将公共养老金的负债转移到对股权投资基金的定义贡献的私人系统。但是，养老社会的唯一出路是提高日本的增长率。如果创造更多的财富，就有更多的东西可以与老年人分享。
Raising productivity.
提高生产力。
There were several ways Japan could break out of the slow-growth straitjacket. Japan's economy had relied on maximizing inputs in order to maximize growth, but economic growth is not just the result of the quantity of inputs, it also involves the quality of their use, productivity. Since the war economy system is based mainly on the mobilization of factor inputs, the Japanese economy had hardly tapped productivity as a source of economic growth. Japanese exporters are famous for their efficiency and high-quality products. So it usually comes as a surprise to observers to learn that in international productivity comparisons, Japan ranks very low down the list, far behind other nations. Point 6.
日本有几种方式可以摆脱低增长的束缚。日本的经济曾依赖于最大化投入以实现最大化增长，但经济增长并非仅仅是投入数量的结果，它还涉及到投入使用的质量及生产力。由于战时经济体系主要依赖于因素投入的动员，日本经济几乎未曾充分利用生产力作为经济增长的源泉。日本的出口商以其效率高和产品质量好而著名，因此，当观察者得知在国际生产力比较中，日本的排名非常低，远远落后于其他国家时，通常会感到惊讶。6.
Productivity is a function of the right incentives, and the best incentive tends to be competition. The export sector had always been exposed to the harshest competition that exists, the world markets. That is why Japanese exporters have been highly productive. but the majority of employment is accounted for by the domestic demand-oriented industries. The wartime system kept the domestic economy cartelized and closed. While competition for ranking existed, it was limited through the cartels. Thus, productivity was not as high as it could have been, especially in the non-manufacturing sector. Given its large share of the economy, this reduced Japan's overall productivity.
生产力是正确激励的功能，而最好的激励往往是竞争。出口部门一直面临着最严酷的竞争世界市场，这就是为什么日本的出口商能够高效生产。但是，大部分就业机会是由面向国内需求的行业提供的。战时体系使国内经济形成了卡特尔并封闭起来。虽然存在排名竞争，但通过卡特尔限制了竞争，因此生产力并未达到可能的最高水平，特别是在非制造业部门。鉴于其在经济中的大份额，这降低了日本的整体生产力。
This presented Japan with an opportunity. The solution to Japan's problem of a declining growth rate was to increase productivity. If Japan managed to use its factor inputs more efficiently, it would be able to increase growth, even if their quantity was shrinking.
这为日本提供了一个机会。解决日本增长率下降的问题的办法是提高生产力。如果日本能够更有效地使用其因素投入，即使其数量在缩小，也能够增加增长。
Productivity could be raised in several ways. One was to retool the economy by shifting from export orientation to an expansion of domestic demand, especially consumer-oriented industries. Another involved a move from an input-based manufacturing sector to an emphasis on high productivity and creative activities in non-manufacturing, such as research and development, innovation, information-based activities, and the service sector in general. Such a shift would also be in line with the demographic trend. More pensioners mean greater demand for the domestic consumer, service, leisure, and welfare-related industries.
可以通过几种方式提高生产力。一种是通过从出口导向转变为扩大国内需求，特别是面向消费者的行业来对经济进行改造。另一种涉及从以投入为基础的制造业转变为强调在非制造业中的高生产力和创新活动，如研发、创新、基于信息的活动以及服务业总体。这种转变也符合人口趋势，更多的退休人员意味着对国内消费者、服务业、休闲和福利相关行业的需求更大。
Thus, Japan had to do what it had never done before in its modern history, turn services and domestic demand into the daily bread of economic growth. During the war, fast growth to maximize physical output was the priority. The service sector was not important and hence had not been afforded a prominent role. Quality of life was a luxury that could not be afforded. Hence, investment in housing, public facilities, cities that are attractive to live in, a sustainable natural environment, short commuting times, and high pay in terms of real purchasing power were badly lacking. The system also did not allow much individual freedom, as that got in the way of the quick execution of collective goals. Open debate and the free expression of views was never a strength of the war economy system, whether at work or in public life. This muffled creativity in many areas.
因此，日本必须做它在现代历史上从未做过的事情，将服务和国内需求转变为经济增长的日常支柱。在战争期间，快速增长以最大化物理产出为优先。服务业并不重要，因此并未被赋予重要角色。生活质量是无法承受的奢侈品，因此对住房、公共设施、宜居城市、可持续的自然环境、短途通勤时间以及实际购买力方面的高薪酬的投资严重不足。该体系也不允许有太多的个人自由，因为这会妨碍集体目标的快速实现。无论是在工作中还是在公共生活中，开放的辩论和自由表达观点从未是战时经济体系的优点，这在许多领域都压制了创造力。
The concern of the central bankers to raise Japanese productivity was probably genuine. Central bankers care about productivity as it determines the maximum potential growth rate that an economy can achieve, given its factor inputs. They primarily control the nominal growth rate of an economy via the quantity of credit creation. How much of that nominal growth will be real and how much will take the form of inflation is not clear. That depends on how much the economy is growing relative to its potential growth rate. Put simply, if nominal growth remains below the potential growth rate, then there are deflationary pressures instead of inflationary ones. factories are idle, and there is unemployment. In such a situation, it is possible to increase nominal growth by increasing credit creation without creating any inflation. If, however, the economy is growing faster than the potential growth rate, then prices will be pushed up and inflation ensues. This can be due either to too much credit creation relative to a given potential growth rate or to a drop in the potential growth rate. So to keep inflation in check, central bankers take great interest in potential growth, and they generally support measures that can raise it.
中央银行家们关心提高日本的生产力，这可能是真心的。中央银行家关心生产力，因为它决定了一个经济体在给定的要素投入下可以达到的最大潜在增长率。他们主要控制一个经济体的名义增长率，通过信贷创造的数量。这个名义增长中有多少是实际增长，有多少会以通胀的形式出现，这是不清楚的。这取决于经济体的增长速度相对于其潜在增长率的快慢。简单来说，如果名义增长保持在潜在增长率以下，那么就会有通缩压力，而不是通胀压力。工厂闲置，存在失业。在这种情况下，可以通过增加信贷创造来增加名义增长，而不会产生任何通胀。然而，如果经济体的增长速度超过了潜在增长率，那么价格就会被推高，通胀就会随之而来。这可能是由于相对于给定的潜在增长率，信贷创造过多，或者潜在增长率下降。因此，为了控制通胀，中央银行家对潜在增长非常关注，他们通常支持可以提高潜在增长的措施。
When Maikawa and Mino reflated the economy in the late 1970s, they probably noticed with concern that growth above 5% would result in inflation, much sooner than in the past. Japan's potential growth rate had dropped. With shrinking factor inputs, it became apparent that the long-term potential growth rate would continue to fall until productivity rose. The princes apparently were convinced that they could raise productivity by abandoning the war economy, deregulating, liberalizing, breaking up the formal and informal cartels, and opening up Japan's economy to the world. The structural reformers got what they wanted.
当前川和三重野在1970年代末重新刺激经济时，他们可能注意到超过 5% 的增长会导致通胀，比过去更早。日本的潜在增长率已经下降。随着要素投入的减少，长期潜在增长率将继续下降，直到生产力提高。这些王子们显然相信，他们可以通过放弃战争经济，进行放松管制、自由化，打破正式和非正式的卡特尔，开放日本的经济，来提高生产力。结构改革者得到了他们想要的。
Indaka accelerated deregulation.
日元升值加速了放松管制。
The Indaka strong yen that accompanied the tight money policy of the 1990s accelerated the shift of manufacturing bases into Asia and helped open up Japan's domestic economy to imports. The unprecedented shift of factories out of the country has virtually created a second Japan outside its borders. In financial year 1995, Japan produced more abroad than it exported from its shores.
伴随着1990年代紧缩货币政策的日元升值，加速了制造业基地向亚洲的转移，并帮助开放了日本的国内经济对进口的接纳。这种前所未有的工厂外移，实际上在日本国外创造了一个第二个日本。在1995财年，日本在海外的生产量超过了其出口量。
Figure 15.2 Import share of manufactured goods.
图 15.2 制造品进口份额。
Source: Ministry of Finance.
来源：财务省。
Simultaneously, the strong yen boosted imports. A large part, of course, consisted of re-imports from Japanese factories that had been shifted abroad. However, imports from Europe and North America have also soared since the mid-1980s. Japan's war economy was characterized by an unusually low share of manufactured goods among imports. The strong yen has changed that. Figure 15.2 shows that, driven by the strengthening yen, the share of manufacturing products among imports more than doubled from a low 26% in 1980 to 64% in 2000, a figure that is rapidly approaching the levels seen in Germany or the United States.
同时，强劲的日元推动了进口的增长。当然，其中很大一部分是由已经转移到海外的日本工厂重新进口的。然而，自1980年代中期以来，来自欧洲和北美的进口也大幅度增长。 日本的战时经济的特点是进口商品中制造品的比例异常低。强劲的日元改变了这一情况，如图示 5.2 所示，受到日元升值的推动，进口商品中制造产品的比例从1980年的低点 26% 增加到2000年的 64%， 这个数字正在迅速接近德国或美国的水平。
The relocation of factories offshore and the influx of manufactured goods, whether from Japanese overseas plants or foreign firms, forced change on the domestic economy. In order to compete with rising imports, firms had to lower prices, reduce inefficiencies, and increase productivity. To do that, employment practices had to change, staff were laid off, and consumer tastes had to be taken more seriously. New jobs had to be created at home in the new industries of the future. But thus far, domestic demand-oriented industries had been less efficient. With foreign products now gaining market share in Japan, from semiconductors to beer, from steel to cars, consumers would no longer be willing to pay high prices for the sake of strong exports.
工厂的海外迁移和制造品的涌入，无论是来自日本的海外工厂还是外国公司，都迫使国内经济发生了变化。为了与日益增长的进口竞争，公司必须降低价格，减少效率低下的情况，并提高生产力。为此，就业方式必须改变，员工被裁员，消费者的口味必须被更加重视。在未来的新型行业中，必须在国内创造新的工作岗位。但到目前为止，以国内需求为导向的行业效率较低。现在，外国产品在日本市场份额的增长，从半导体到啤酒，从钢铁到汽车，消费者不再愿意为了强大的出口而支付高昂的价格。
How could the domestic and service-oriented sectors be made more efficient? The same way that in the past manufacturing exporters became efficient, through competition. With the manufacturing base shifting offshore, deregulation and greater import penetration became an important option to create new jobs. In turn, deregulation in one area created economic pressures for further deregulation in other areas. The effects of deregulation accumulated exponentially, painfully slowly in the beginning, but picking up speed sharply.
如何使国内和以服务为导向的行业更加高效？就像过去制造业出口商通过竞争变得高效一样。随着制造业基地向海外转移，放松管制和增加进口渗透成为创造新工作岗位的重要选择。反过来，一个领域的放松管制会对其他领域产生进一步放松管制的经济压力。放松管制的效果呈指数级增长，开始时痛苦的缓慢，但速度迅速提高。
The tide turns to transformation.
潮流转向转型。
In April 1995, thanks to the double crisis of economic slump and historic yen strength, the reformers at the BOJ, in MIDI, and among the politicians managed to break the bureaucratic resistance against deregulation. The shock of the yen at yen 80/$ convinced even die-hard conservatives that Japan had no choice but to deregulate. Thus, only weeks after the historic high of the yen, a far-reaching deregulation package was announced, consisting of a catalog of 1,000 deregulation items. A deregulation white paper followed later in the year. Moreover, in 1996 and 1997, the reformers had won enough political support to push for their biggest challenge to the old war economy establishment, a full-scale deregulation of the financial sector. The Big Bang started in April 1998 with the deregulation of the foreign exchange law. That, indeed, symbolizes the end of the war economy because, as we saw, it was the foreign exchange laws that began the introduction of the war economy in the 1930s.
1995年4月，由于经济衰退和历史性的日元强势的双重危机，日本银行、经济产业省以及政界的改革者们成功地打破了对放松管制的官僚阻力。日元对美元达到80的冲击，甚至使顽固的保守派相信日本别无选择，只能放松管制。因此，在日元达到历史高点后的几周内，宣布了一项深远的放松管制方案，包括1000项放松管制的目录。年底还发布了一份放松管制白皮书。此外，在1996年和1997年，改革者们赢得了足够的政治支持，以推动他们对旧战时经济体制的最大挑战——全面放松金融部门的管制。1998年4月，外汇法的放松管制拉开了大爆炸的序幕。这确实象征着战时经济的结束，因为正如我们所看到的， 正是外汇法开始了1930年代战时经济的引入。
Previously, only licensed foreign exchange banks could deal in foreign currencies. Now foreign exchange transactions can be undertaken by anybody. Capital can flow freely into or out of the country. The liberalization of stockbroking commissions, the blurring of the distinctions between different types of financial institutions, and the opening up of the financial sector to players from outside as well as other fields inside Japan, such as retailer Ito Yakato, bring fierce competition with global leaders onto the home turf. All the barriers against foreign firms had come down. The doors to the domestic financial sector and hence to the entire economy are now open to the world. Hence, foreign firms took large stakes in leading Japanese firms, unthinkable a decade earlier. For example, Merrill Lynch took over the bankrupt Yamaichi Securities, the Travelers Group bought a quarter of Nikko Securities, and the U.S. fund Ripplewood bought once mighty long-term credit bank.
以前，只有获得许可的外汇银行才能进行外汇交易。现在，任何人都可以进行外汇交易，资本可以自由地流入或流出国家。股票经济用金的自由化，不同类型的金融机构之间的界限的模糊，以及金融部门对外部以及日本国内其他领域，如零售商伊藤洋华堂的开放，都带来了与全球领导者在本土的激烈竞争。所有阻止外国公司的障碍都已消除，国内金融部门乃至整个经济现在都向全世界开放。因此，外国公司在日本领先公司中占据了大量股份，这在10年前是不可想象的。例如，美林证券接管了破产的山宜证券，旅行者集团购买了日光证券的1/4，美国基金 Ripplewood 购买了曾经强大的长期信贷银行。
Japan is shifting its economic system to U.S.-style markets, and that also means that the center of the economy is being moved from banks to stock markets. To entice depositors to pull their money out of the safe bank and postal savings deposits and into the risky equity market, reformers have withdrawn the blanket guarantee on all bank deposits and proposed to privatize or abolish the postal savings system, while creating tax incentives for stock investments.
日本正在将其经济体系转向美国式的市场，这也意味着经济的中心正在从银行转向股票市场。为了吸引储户将他们的资金从安全的银行和邮政储蓄存款中提取出来，投入到风险较高的股票市场，改革者们已经取消了对所有银行存款的全面保证，并提议私有化或废除邮政储蓄系统，同时为股票投资创造税收优惠。
From collectivism to individualism.
从集体主义到个人主义。
Since mid-1994, probably for the first time ever in Japanese history, the service sector employed more people than the manufacturing sector. Meanwhile, firms, forced to boost productivity, have switched from the lockstep seniority system to merit-based pay that could have large rewards for creative individuals. They have adopted flexible year-round hiring. As the educational system shifts gear from being one aimed at producing human inputs into hardware production by focusing on rote memorization to becoming one that encourages individuality and creativity, the social landscape will change as well.
自1994年中期以来，可能是日本历史上首次服务业雇佣的人数超过了制造业。与此同时，企业为了提高生产力，已经从严格的资历制度转向了可能为创新个体带来大量回报的绩效工资制度。他们采用了灵活的全年招聘。随着教育系统从注重死记硬背、以生产硬件为目标的模式转变为鼓励个性和创新的模式，社会景观也将发生变化。
In 1960, there were over 1,000 legal cartels, granted exemption from the anti-monopoly law. By 1998, deregulation had reduced the number to almost 0.7. In addition to the official cartels, there were a number of special laws that had created barriers to entry in many industries. However, many of these have now been revised. The revision of the large-scale retail law boosted the number of consumer-oriented large-scale shops that are discounting heavily. In 1993, the telecommunications sector was deregulated, which created a significant boom in mobile phones and boosted employment in the information services sector dramatically. In 1996, the electric enterprise law was changed to allow firms other than utilities to generate electricity. Other examples include the deregulation of the gasoline retailing law. Public prosecutors have also become tough on corporate racketeers, construction dango, and formal collusive agreements. And other practices that the war system had brought with it. Point 8 The Fair Trade Commission has been strengthened and made more meaningfully independent. Having previously acted in the interest of the monopolists, it seems now to be seeking to restrict their influence. Japan's new product liability law of 1995 for the first time explicitly favors consumers. In case of dispute, the burden of proof has now been placed on the manufacturer.
1960年，有超过1000个合法的卡特尔被免除了反垄断法的约束。到1998年，由于放松管制，这个数字几乎降到了0。其除了官方的卡特尔外，还有一些特殊的法律在许多行业中设立了进入壁垒。然而，现在许多这些法律已经被修订。大规模零售法的修订增加了大量以消费者为导向的大型折扣店。1993年，电信行业的放松管制创造了手机的显著繁荣，并极大地提高了信息服务行业的就业率。1996年，电力企业法被修改，允许除公用事业外的公司发电。其他例子包括汽油零售法的放松管制。公诉人也对企业敲诈勒索者、建筑业的非正式合谋协议 （dango） 以及战争体系带来的其他做法采取了严厉的态度。巴公平贸易委员会已经得到了加强，并且变得更加有意义的独立。虽然以前是为了垄断者的利益而行动，但现在似乎正在寻求限制他们的影响力。日本1995年的新产品责任法首次明确地偏向消费者。在争议的情况下，现在已经将举证责任放在了制造商身上。
Political system change.
政治体系的变化。
The systemic change did not stop at the economic system. The numerous scandals that followed the bursting of the bubble also brought down the 1955 system of stable one-party rule by the LDP. In the old system, politicians did not compete by proposing different policies. Policy was made by the bureaucrats, and the politicians merely focused on appeasing local constituencies with public works projects. Since the Japanese electoral law had given the rural vote a much bigger weight, up to 3 times that of the city vote, this meant that politicians had to please rural constituencies in particular. That gave the agricultural lobby its power over government policies. The 1993 Hosokawa administration changed the electoral system and thus politics, which is now catering more to city dwellers. Imports of agricultural products rose. The rice market was forced open in 1993, thanks to the government's reduction in official rice supply stocks to the lowest level on record in the post-war era. This allowed bad weather to create a rice shortage, and public opinion was influenced favorably toward the liberalization of rice imports. 9.
这种体系的变化并没有停止在经济体系上。随着泡沫经济的破裂，接踵而至的众多丑闻也打倒了自1955年以来由自民党稳定一党执政的体系。在旧体系中，政治家并不是通过提出不同的政策来竞争，政策是由官僚制定的，而政治家只是专注于通过公共工程项目来安抚地方选民。由于日本的选举法赋予了农村选票更大的权重，高达城市选票的3倍，这意味着政治家必须特别取悦农村选民。这使得农业游说团体对政府政策具有影响力。1993年的细川政府改变了选举制度，从而改变了政治。现在的政治更多地迎合城市居民。农产品的进口增加了。由于政府将官方稻米供应库存降至战后历史最低水平，1993年稻米市场被迫开放，这使得恶劣的天气造成了稻米短缺。公众舆论对稻米进口的自由化产生了积极的影响。
Politicians, with their power bases increasingly in the cities and not the rural farms, found that voters liked the idea of a higher quality of life and standard of living. Thus, politicians of almost all parties have since the mid-1990s been competing to present themselves as radical reformers. They have started to take power away from bureaucrats and increasingly make the key decisions. In October 1997, for the first time in post-war history, all policy initiatives to stimulate the economy originated from politicians, not bureaucrats.
政治家们的权力基础越来越多地集中在城市，而不是农村农场。他们发现选民喜欢更高的生活质量和生活水平的想法。因此，自20世纪90年代中期以来，几乎所有党派的政治家都在竞相展示自己作为激进改革者的形象。他们开始从官僚手中夺取权力， 并越来越多地做出关键决策。1997年10月，战后历史上首次，所有刺激经济的政策倡议都来自政治家，而不是官僚。
The arrival of the Koizumi administration was a reminder of the popularity of the earlier reformer government under Hosokawa. By now, however, the consensus toward a deep structural transformation of Japan had become deeply ingrained. Koizumi's popularity was also a much more important factor for him in retaining his position. For the first time, a prime minister was in power due more to his general popularity with the voters than his support among the LDP factions.
小泉政府的到来提醒人们对早期细川政府改革的欢迎。然而，现在对日本进行深层次结构转变的共识已经深深地根植在人们心中。小泉的人气对他保住职位也是一个更重要的因素。首次有一位首相的权力更多的来自于他在选民中的普遍人气，而不是他在自民党派系中的支持。
The 10 years that changed Japan.
改变日本的10年。
Maekawa's 10-year plan effectively called for Japan's economy to revert to the freer markets that existed in Japan in the 1920s and to turn the producer economy back into a consumer economy. Thanks to the policies taken by the princes, all the main goals had been achieved by the end of the 1990s. Foremost among them, the Okurasho had been considerably weakened and the BOJ had become independent in 1998. With this, bureaucratic resistance to deregulation had been broken. But this was not all. The plan to change Japan had set in motion economic forces that continue to work today. The bubble accomplished 3 things. First, it taught Japanese consumers that spending money could be enjoyable. During the late 1980s, conspicuous consumption appeared for the first time in post-war Japan. Though centered on the rich speculators, it took away the social stigma that conspicuous consumption had had for decades. The second result of the bubble was to send a wave of Japanese foreign investment abroad, partly to shift factories offshore. Third, the bubble set the stage for the recession, which continued the re-education. It taught consumers newly acquainted with the joys of shopping to demand value for money. Thanks to the deflation of the 1990s, price destruction appeared for the first time and discounting spread widely. The recession also initiated deep structural changes in the economy, as companies were forced to lay off workers, unemployment was pushed up, and Japan's traditional lifetime and seniority-based employment system was eroded.
前川的10年计划实际上要求日本的经济回归到20世纪20年代日本存在的更自由的市场，并将生产者经济转变为消费者经济。得益于王子们采取的政策，到20世纪90年代末，所有主要目标都已实现。其中最重要的是，大藏省已经被大大削弱，日本银行在1998年变得独立。有了这个，官僚对于放松管制的抵制已经被打破。但这还不是全部。改变日本的计划已经启动了经济力量，这些力量至今仍在运作。泡沫经济实现了3件事：首先，它教会了日本消费者花钱可以是一种享受。在20世纪80年代末，炫耀性消费在战后日本首次出现。尽管这主要集中在富有的投机者身上，但它消除了几十年来炫耀性消费的社会耻辱。泡沫的第二个结果是引发了一波日本的海外投资潮，部分原因是为了将工厂转移到海外。第三，泡沫为经济衰退铺平了道路，这继续了再教育，它教会了新近熟悉购物乐趣的消费者要求物有所值。得益于20世纪90年代的通货紧缩，价格破坏首次出现，折扣广泛传播。经济衰退也引发了经济的深层次结构变化。因为公司被迫裁员，失业率上升，日本的传统终身和资历为基础的就业制度被侵蚀。
Striking at the core of the war economy system.
打击战争经济体系的核心。
As we saw in the early chapters, when the war economy system was established, the reduced influence of individual shareholders through diluting cross-shareholdings put managers in charge and allowed them to pursue growth irrespective of dividend payments. Firms could afford to maintain cross-shareholdings even if stock prices fell, because Japan was using German-style book value AC counting. Without pressure from shareholders, firms could plan for the long term and grow fast. Book value accounting had the additional benefit that it shielded companies from unnecessary volatility due to stock market movements. This contributed to overall economic stability.
正如我们在早期章节中看到的，当战争经济体系建立时， 通过稀释交叉持股，降低了个人股东的影响力，使管理者能够掌握主导权，并允许他们不考虑股息支付的情况下追求增长。即使股票价格下跌，公司也能够维持交叉持股，因为日本正在使用德国式的账面价值会计。没有股东的压力，公司可以进行长期规划并快速增长。账面价值会计还有一个额外的好处，那就是它可以保护公司免受股市波动带来的不必要的波动，这有助于整体经济稳定。
This system of capitalism without capitalists had become increasingly embattled during the 1990s. The collapse of share prices and the credit crunch forced many companies to sell off cross-shareholdings that had been created during the war and in the post-war era. That meant the return of shareholder power. At the same time, with Japanese equity prices on a falling trend in the 1990s, and with the Nikkei 225 index having closed at a 20-year low on the last day of 2002, foreign investors have seized the opportunity to buy the ownership of Japanese companies, something that had not been possible in earlier decades. In March 1999, the share of stocks listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange that were owned by foreigners reached a post-war record high of 14.1%. By March 2001, this had risen to 18.3%, a long way above the 2.8% foreign ownership recorded in 1978.10. The protective structural barriers against foreign takeovers built up in the early post-war years were increasingly crumbling. Foreign institutional investors now demand higher dividends and better returns on assets than the old-style Japanese corporation was willing to deliver.
在20世纪90年代，这种没有资本家的资本主义体系日益受到挑战。股价的崩溃和信贷紧缩迫使许多公司出售在战争期间和战后时期建立的交叉持股，这意味着股东权利的回归。与此同时，由于日本股票价格在20世纪90年代呈下降趋势，以及日经225指数在2002年最后一天创下20年来的最低点，外国投资者抓住了机会购买日本公司的所有权，这在过去的几十年里是不可能的。到1999年3月，东京证券交易所上市股票的外国持股比例达到了战后的最高纪录，为 14.1%。到2001年3月，这一比例已经上升到 18.3%， 远高于1978年记录的 2.8% 的外国持股比例。早期战后年代建立的防止外国收购的保护性结构壁垒正在逐渐崩溃。外国机构投资者现在要求的股息和资产回报率比老式的日本公司愿意提供的要高。
The return of the capitalists.
资本家的回归。
Battered by criticism, the Ministry of Finance also agreed to adopt a radical change in Japan's accounting standards. Fiscal year 2001 was the first in Japanese history that company books were calculated according to market value accounting. MAF, by this time keen to please critics inside and outside Japan, was persuaded to adopt international best practice by dropping book value accounting in favor of US-style marking to market. It did not bother MAF that the majority of industrialized countries have not yet adopted this accounting standard, which is first and foremost a US standard.
在批评的压力下，日本财务省也同意采取在日本会计准则上的激进改变。2001财年是日本历史上第一次按照市值会计计算公司账目。为了取悦日本国内外的批评者，财务省被说服采用国际最佳实践，放弃账面价值会计，转而采用美国式的市值会计。财务省并不在乎大多数工业化国家还没有采用这种首先是美国的会计准则。
The change to market value accounting may sound like a fairly innocuous move by gray accountants. But with this seemingly harmless change in accounting rules, the bookkeepers made significant progress where decades of colorful U.S. trade negotiators had failed. The change sharply accelerated the transformation away from the war economy corporate governance structure and toward shareholder capitalism. Since companies and banks were made to suffer for owning underperforming shares, they had a strong incentive to dissolve their cross-shareholdings. Thus, they have been dumping their previously stable stock holdings in fire sale operations that peaked especially around book closing, such as in March 2001 and September 2001, each time exerting strong downward pressure on the stock market. Plans were announced to legally require banks to reduce their stock holdings further over several years. This completes the unraveling of cross-shareholdings that has been taking place throughout the 1990s. By 2005, the corporate governance landscape will be reshaped. The main bank system is becoming history. Cross-shareholdings will have become the exception, not the rule. As a result, accountability to shareholders is beginning to become a reality for the first time since the 1920s. Corporate management is becoming increasingly profit-oriented, and companies are run for the benefit of shareholders, not managers and employees. Capitalism for capitalists has returned to Japan.
市值会计的改变可能听起来像是灰色会计师的一个相当无害的举动，但是随着这个看似无害的会计规则的改变，会计师在几十年的美国贸易谈判失败的地方取得了重大进展。这一变化极大地加速了从战时经纪公司治理结构向股东资本主义的转变。由于公司和银行因持有表现不佳的股票而受到惩罚，他们有强烈的动力解散他们的交叉持股。因此，他们一直在抛售他们以前稳定的股票持有。在账目结算时，如2001年3月和2001年9月，尤其是在火爆的销售操作中，每次都对股市产生了强烈的下行压力。有计划在几年内，法律要求银行进一步减少他们的股票持有，这完成了在20世纪90年代一直在进行的交叉持股的解散。到2005年，公司治理的格局将被重塑，主要的银行系统正在成为历史。交叉持股将成为例外，而不是规则。因此，对股东的问责开始成为自1920年代以来的第一次现实。公司管理越来越以利润为导向，公司是为了股东的利益而运营，而不是经理和员工。资本家的资本主义已经回归日本。
Change is on my mind.
改变在我心中。
Before countries change, mindsets must change. There can be no doubt that the new consensus against the post-war system emerged as a result of the recession. There may be a way to quantify this. Considering the 4 Nikkei newspapers in Japan and counting the number of articles in a year that were devoted to 3 key topics of structural change, we find evidence of such change. 11 Figure 15.3 shows that articles on amicutary, bureaucrats parachuting into private sector positions and hence informally controlling the industries they have previously supervised, began to soar from 1992 onward. The foreign domestic price differential, Figure 15.4, a reflection of Japan's closed, export-oriented economic structure, became a buzzword from 1992. Discussions of deregulation, Figure 15.5, with several thousand articles written in a year, really took off in 1992. One may wonder what happened in that year. The simple answer is that 1992 was the year when the recession started. As a result, the old economic structure was criticized and a fundamental rethinking began. 12.
在国家改变之前，思维方式必须改变。毫无疑问，对战后体系的新共识是由于经济衰退而产生的。这可能有一种量化的方法。考虑日本的4家日经新闻报纸统计1年中专门讨论3个关键结构改革主题的文章数量，我们发现了这种改变的证据。图15.3显示，关于天降官员降落到私营部门的职位，从而非正式地控制他们以前监管的行业的文章，从1992年开始激增。外国国内价格差，图15.4反映了日本封闭的以出口为导向的经济结构，从1992年开始成为一个热门词汇。关于放松管制，图15.5的讨论，1年中写了几千篇文章，真正开始于1992年。人们可能会想知道那一年发生了什么。简单的答案是，1992年是经济衰退开始的一年。结果，旧的经济结构受到了批评，基本的反思开始。
The post-bubble recession of the 1990s succeeded in shifting the consensus from being in favor of the wartime economic system, as was still the case in the mid-1980s, to its diametric opposite. Today, most intellectuals in Japan have come to agree with the slogan of Prime Minister Koizumi, who started his reform-oriented administration in 2001. No economic recovery without structural change. It has become a consensus in Japan that the old system does not work anymore and has to be scrapped.
20世纪90年代的泡沫后衰退成功地改变了人们对战时经济体系的共识，这在1980年代中期仍然是主流观点，但现在已经完全相反。今天，日本的大多数知识分子都同意小泉纯一郎首相的口号，他在2001年开始了他的改革导向的政府，没有结构性变革就没有经济复苏。 在日本已经形成了一个共识，急救的体系已经不再适用，必须被废弃。
Observers even began to wake up to the wartime roots of the post-war system, and that seemed to further condemn it. An editorial in the widely read Yomiuri newspaper suddenly thundered in mid-2000, in the 10 years since the collapse of the bubble economy, the government has tried every financial and fiscal policy possible. But the economic slump is still continuing because the government has never attempted to revamp the fatigued economic and social systems of the wartime regime. The 10-year slump seemed evidence enough to most observers that the post-war system did not work anymore.
观察者甚至开始意识到战后体系的战时根源，这似乎进一步证明了它的不合适。在2000年中期，广受欢迎的读卖新闻的一篇社论突然猛烈抨击，自泡沫经济崩溃以来的10年里，政府尝试了所有可能的财政和货币政策。但由于政府从未试图改革战时政权疲惫不堪的经济和社会体系，经济衰退仍在继续。对大多数观察者来说，10年的经济低迷似乎足以证明战后体系已经不再适用。
There can be little doubt that later historians will conclude that the slump of the 1990s marks a historic turning point in Japan's economic, social, and political system. Believing that the system itself was to blame, policymakers scrapped the structure that had created the post-war miracle economy. They abandoned the war economy system. Japan is now well advanced on the path to implementing US-style capitalism. It appears as if the Bank of Japan has done the right thing, after all.
毫无疑问，后来的历史学家会得出结论：20世纪90年代的经济低迷标志着日本经济、社会和政治体系的历史性转折点。政策制定者们认为体系本身是问题所在，于是废弃了创造了战后奇迹经济的结构。他们放弃了战时经济体系。日本现在已经在实施美式资本主义的道路上取得了很大的进展。看起来，日本银行做得很对。
Figure 15.3 articles with keyword amicutary in the Nikkei newspapers.
图 15.3 日经新闻中带有关键词天下的文章。
Source: Nihon Keizai Shimbun.
来源：日本经济新闻。
Figure 15.4 articles with keyword foreign domestic price differential in the Nikkei newspapers.
图 15.4 日经新闻中带有关键词国内外价格差的文章。
Source: Nihon Keizai Shimbun.
来源：日本经济新闻。
Figure 15.5 articles with keyword deregulation in the Nikkei newspapers.
图 15.5 日经新闻中带有放松管制关键词的文章。
Source: Nihon Keizai Shimbun.
来源：日本经济新闻。
Shareholder capitalism or welfare capitalism?
股东资本主义还是福利资本主义？
Even if we ignore the inappropriate way in which the central bank facilitated these structural changes, there are two reasons why its actions were not justified. First, there was an alternative for Japan to introducing US-style capitalism. The problem of falling factor inputs and low productivity that Japan experienced beginning in the 1970s did not mean that the old system had to be abandoned. It could simply have been adjusted. All that was needed was to use the key control tool, credit creation, to supply the non-manufacturing and service sectors, especially high-value added activities such as education, research and development, information services, software development, and telecommunications, as well as welfare-enhancing projects such as housing and public facilities and environmental projects and industries, with new purchasing power. Incentive structures could have been redesigned to allow for a greater degree of individual freedom and public debate. Purchasing power allocated to low-productivity activities, such as the traditional distribution system, sunset manufacturing industries, and the like could be slowly phased out, thus producing a natural shrinkage of these sectors and efforts to restructure or relocate offshore.
即使我们忽略中央银行以不适当的方式推动这些结构性变化，其行动也没有得到正当化的2个原因。首先，日本有引入美式资本主义的替代方案。日本从1970年代开始经历的要素投入下降和生产率低下的问题，并不意味着必须放弃旧的体系，它只需要进行适当的调整，只需要使用关键的控制工具及信贷创造为非制造业和服务业，特别是教育、研发、信息服务、软件开发和电信，以及提升福利的项目，如住房和公共设施，以及环保项目和行业提供新的购买力。 激励结构可以被重新设计，以允许更大程度的个人自由和公共辩论。分配给低生产力活动，如传统的分销系统、落日制造业等的购买力可以逐渐淘汰，从而产生这些部门的自然萎缩和重组或海外搬迁的努力。
With such credit policies, the emphasis of Japan's economic system would quickly change. The structure of the miracle economy, based on capitalism without capitalists and competition for size, not profits, could be maintained. As long as the key control tool, credit creation, was under democratic supervision, Japan's economy could then continue to deliver high economic growth while at the same time enhancing the standard of living and quality of life of its population, continuing an egalitarian ownership and safeguard its achievements in terms of social justice. The war economy system has helped Japan avoid the disadvantages and significant human costs of free market-style capitalism, namely, great income and wealth inequalities, high unemployment, high crime rates, and social injustice of many kinds. These advantages could be maintained if the system as such was kept but updated to suit the times.
有了这样的信贷政策，日本的经济体系的重点将迅速改变。基于没有资本家的资本主义和规模竞争而非利润竞争的奇迹经济的结构可以得以维持。只要关键的控制工具及信贷创造处于民主监督之下，日本的经济就可以在提高生活水平和生活质量的同时，继续实现高经济增长，继续实现平等的所有权，并保护其在社会公正方面的成就。战时经济体系帮助日本避免了自由市场式资本主义的缺点和重大的人力成本，即巨大的收入和财富不平等、高失业率、高犯罪率和各种形式的社会不公。如果系统本身得以保持，但更新以适应时代，这些优势可以得以维持。
Such a transformation of a war economy system into a successfully modified and modernized structure has a historical precedent. In the early post-war decades, Germany underwent a similar structural break when, under Ludwig Erhard, it made the conscious decision to preserve the advantages of the economic system established in the 1930s but improve it by shifting its goal further away from output maximization to raising the standard of living of the population.
将战争经济体系成功地转变为改良和现代化的结构，这在历史上有先例。在战后的几十年初期，德国在路德维希·艾哈德的领导下，经历了类似的结构性转变。他做出了保留1930年代建立的经济体系优势，但通过将其目标从产出最大化转向提高人口生活水平的有意识决定，从而改善了这个体系。
German model.
德国模式。
The result was a combination of the collectivist war economy and the U.S.-style free markets. Worker protection and participation in corporate management remained high, ensuring that the profits produced were divided fairly between the three stakeholder groups: shareholders, managers, and employees. The financial system remained centered on banks, thus allowing allocation of newly created credit directly to productive corporations. Speculative loans to the real estate sector were kept low by regulatory control that implied low loan valuation ratios of real estate-related lending. At the same time, entrepreneurs were rewarded far more than the war economy system allowed. Thanks to the corporatist structure, worker representation ensured that a reasonable share of corporate profits would go to workers and employees, not just fat cat capitalists. As a result, the income structure remained far more egalitarian than in the United States. Most of all, resources were allocated toward raising living conditions.
结果是集体主义战争经济和美式自由市场的结合，工人保护和参与公司管理的程度保持在高位，确保所产生的利润公平地分配给三个利益相关者群体，即股东、经理和员工。金融体系仍以银行为中心，从而允许将新创造的信贷直接分配给生产性公司。通过监管控制，将对房地产部门的投机贷款保持在低位，这意味着房地产相关贷款的低贷款估值比率。与此同时，企业家得到的回报远超过战争经济体系所允许的。由于公司结构的特性，工人代表确保了合理份额的公司利润将流向工人和雇员，而不仅仅是肥猫资本家。因此，收入结构比在美国更为平等。最重要的是，资源被分配用于提高生活条件。
The Germans called this hybrid economic system the Sozialmarktwirtschaft, or social market economy. Point 14 The post-war transformation succeeded beyond expectations, as the high growth rates of post-war Germany, also dubbed a miracle economy, attest. Taking purchasing power, size of houses, distance to work, working hours, cost and quality of education, and other such issues into account. There can be little doubt that the quality of life and standard of living of the average German is among the highest of the industrialized countries, exceeding that of the average American.
德国人将这种混合经济体系称为社会市场经济或 social Marktwirtschaft。战后的转型超出了预期，战后德国的高增长率也被誉为奇迹经济，就是证明。考虑到购买力、房屋大小、上班距离、工作时间、教育的成本和质量等问题，毫无疑问，德国普通人的生活质量和生活水平在工业化国家中是最高的，超过了美国普通人的水平。
Japan could have opted for going the German way in the 1990s. But there was another way to enhance productivity: entirely abandon the war economic system. By freeing the domestic economy from regulations and cartels, by abandoning the seniority pay system, and most of all by making the shareholder the ultimate lord over the firm again, entrepreneurs could be given incentives to start up new, creative firms in the new service industries. Productivity could be boosted by reversing the half-century of war economy and reverting to the free-for-all style of capitalism that existed in the 1920s. But in that case, all advantages of the egalitarian third way system would be lost, and Japan would also import the disadvantages of unmitigated capitalism that its leaders sought to avoid in the 1930s.
日本本可以在1990年代选择走德国的路，但是还有另一种提高生产力的方法：完全放弃战争经济体系，通过解放国内经济，摆脱规章制度和卡特尔，放弃高级职位的薪酬制度。最重要的是，再次让股东成为公司的最终主宰，可以激励企业家在新的服务行业中创办新的有创造力的公司。生产力可以通过逆转半个世纪的战争经济，回归到1920年代的无拘无束的资本主义风格来提高。但在这种情况下，平等的第三条道路体系的所有优势都将丧失，日本也将引入其领导人在1930年代试图避免的无节制资本主义的缺点。
No public debate. The princes decide for you.
没有公开辩论，王子们为你做决定。
Given the significance of the decision whether to reform and improve the war economy system or abandon it entirely and introduce free markets, a widespread public debate would have been crucial. Of course, the cost of changing over from one system to another would have to be added into the calculation, tilting it in favor of going the German way. Ideally, the population would be asked and a decision would be reached in a democratic fashion, based on fair and objective information. In reality, there was no public debate. Very few people were even aware of the issues that were at stake.
鉴于决定是否改革和完善战时经济体系，或者完全放弃并引入自由市场的重要性，广泛的公众辩论本应至关重要。当然，从一个体系转变为另一个体系的成本必须计入计算中，这使得选择德国的方式更具吸引力。理想情况下，应该询问民众，并以公正和客观的信息为基础，以民主方式做出决定。然而，现实是没有公众辩论，甚至很少有人意识到这个问题的关键所在。
The early post-war leaders knew that they were running a war economy, but they chose not to talk for political reasons. The Cold War propaganda message was that post-war Japan had adopted a US-style political and economic system. Unwilling to tell the truth, the leaders, including the Showa emperor himself, took their intimate knowledge about the origin of Japan's miracle economy with them to the grave. A generation of bureaucrats and politicians reigned in the 1980s and 1990s who did not even understand the true character and purpose of their own country's economy. Likewise, leading thinkers in the United States have little knowledge about the character of Japan's war economy, its advantages and possibilities. Ironically, a whole generation of Japan's elite had been sent to the United States to receive PhD, S, and MB as in US-style economics in the post-war era. They arrived back in Japan trained in the theories of the free markets. Yet they had never received any formal training in the principles of their own economy. In the post-war years, partly due to the need to cover up its roots, there had not been a proper theory of how the Japanese war economy system worked and what its advantages were.
早期的战后领导人知道他们正在运行一个战时经济， 但他们出于政治原因选择不谈论。冷战宣传信息是，战后的日本采用了美国式的政治和经济体系。领导人，包括昭和天皇本人，不愿说出真相，他们带着对日本奇迹经济起源的深入了解走向了坟墓。在1980年代和1990年代，一代官僚和政治家统治着，他们甚至不了解自己国家经济的真正性质和目的。同样，美国的主要思想家对日本战时经济的性质、优势和可能性知之甚少。讽刺的是，整整一代日本精英在战后被送到美国接受博士和 MBA 的美国式经济学教育，他们接受了自由市场理论的训练，回到日本。然而，他们从未接受过自己国家经济原则的正式训练。在战后的年代，部分原因是需要掩盖其根源，没有关于日本战时经济体系如何运作以及其优势是什么的适当理论。
Since neoclassical economics assumes that there is only one type of economic system, namely, unmitigated free markets, where shareholders and central bankers rule supreme, the young, bright Japanese elite quickly came to regurgitate the arguments of U.S. economists. When U.S. commentators were demanding that Japan change its system, neither economists and business leaders nor bureaucrats and politicians in Japan were able to counter U.S. arguments. Many older Japanese leaders instinctively felt that the Japanese system had served the people well and so should not be hastily abandoned. However, they failed to provide a convincing rationale for their arguments. U.S. leaders, drawing on decades of research into the free market theory, had an easy time winning the public debate. Thus, there has never been a debate about whether Japan's productivity should be enhanced by reforming the old system or by abandoning it. Those in charge of window guidance never gave such a debate a chance.
由于新古典经济学假设只有一种经济体系及无节制的自由市场，股东和中央银行家至高无上，年轻聪明的日本精英很快就开始复述美国经济学家的观点。当美国评论家要求日本改变其体系时，日本的经济学家、商业领袖、官僚和政治家都无法反驳美国的观点。许多年长的日本领导人本能地感觉到日本的体系已经很好地为人民服务，因此不应该轻易放弃。然而，他们未能为他们的观点提供有说服力的理由。美国领导人凭借对自由市场理论几十年的研究，很容易赢得公众辩论。因此，从未有过关于日本的生产力是否应通过改革旧体系或放弃旧体系来提高的辩论。负责窗口指导的人从未给这样的辩论一个机会。
Reform cost excessive.
改革成本过高。
When considering the option of modifying the Japanese system and entirely scrapping it by means of a long and deep recession, any cost-benefit analysis would have to conclude that it does not make sense to purposely prolong a recession, even if structural benefits emerge in the long run. To use a simple analogy, cyclical policies aim at economic growth, hence at boosting the size of the national income pie. Structural policies aim at efficiency, which is the ease with which a given pie is cut up and allocated. While structural reform may indeed succeed in marginally increasing the efficiency of the economy, as measured by certain indicators, it seems clear that the enormous economic and social costs of the 10-year recession have greatly outstripped the potential benefits. To prolong the recession for the sake of implementing structural change is akin to shrinking a cake to a tiny size in order to be able to cut it up more easily.
当考虑修改日本体系，并通过长期和深度衰退完全废除它的选项时，任何成本效益分析都必须得出这样的结论：故意延长衰退没有意义，即使长期来看可能会产生结构性的好处。用一个简单的比喻，周期性政策旨在经济增长，因此旨在提高国民收入的规模；结构性政策旨在效率，即以给定的方式切割和分配的便利性。虽然结构改革可能确实成功的在一定程度上提高了经济的效率，如某些指标所示，但显然10年衰退的巨大经济和社会成本远远超过了潜在的好处。为了实施结构性变革而延长衰退，就像为了更容易的切割而将蛋糕缩小到很小的尺寸。
Forward to the past.
回到过去。
Many observers are still convinced that the reform plans of Junichiro Koizumi, who became prime minister in April 2001, would be positive for Japan. Among them, he gave prominence to his demands that various publicly owned companies, most notably the post office, ought to be privatized. This is indeed the most concrete reform plan, and one that Koizumi has proposed throughout his career. Yet it is difficult to see how such a reform will affect economic growth. Ownership of the public entities has not changed in the post-war era or even over the past century. Yet economic growth has changed. Japan moved into recession in the 1990s, although there was no increase in ownership of public corporations. Over the long run, if anything, one may detect a positive correlation between growth and the existence of these public institutions. Their creation provided some of the infrastructure for Japan's phenomenal economic growth.
许多观察家仍然坚信，2001年4月上任的小泉纯一郎的改革计划对日本将是有益的。在他的诸多要求中，他强调了各种公有公司，尤其是邮局，应该被私有化。这确实是最具体的改革计划，也是小泉纯一郎在其职业生涯中一直提出的计划。然而，很难看出这样的改革将如何影响经济增长。公共实体的所有权在战后时期，甚至在过去的1个世纪里都没有改变。然而，经济增长却发生了变化。日本在1990年代陷入了衰退，尽管公共公司的所有权并没有增加。从长远来看，如果有什么的话，人们可能会发现经济增长与这些公共机构的存在之间存在正相关性，他们的创建为日本惊人的经济增长提供了一些基础设施。
What, then, is the attraction of privatization? It is often argued that privatization increases efficiency, as market forces will make those firms more productive and profit-oriented. Yet Japan's public sector employment as a share of total employment remains modest by international comparison. Moreover, the quality and reliability of public services must rank among the top in the world.
那么，私有化的吸引力在哪里呢？人们常常认为私有化会提高效率，因为市场力量会使这些公司更具生产力和盈利导向。然而，日本的公共部门就业占总就业的比例在国际上仍然相对较低。此外，公共服务的质量和可靠性必须在世界上名列前茅。
It is true that selling the public utilities to private investors is likely to boost the profit orientation of these entities. But is this necessarily a good thing? Private sector firms look after the interests of their owners. To avoid this is precisely why public sector institutions were created. They are supposed to work in the interest of the public. It is well known that markets cannot effectively manage goods from which everyone can easily benefit, namely, such public goods as the environment, education, and public infrastructure, such as parks, roads, and postal services. Private owners would not invest as much as is socially efficient. This market failure is why public goods usually are kept in the hands of the government. This is also true for industries with a natural monopoly that can only sustain a small number of firms. Leaving their operation in the hands of the private sector would lead to monopolies that disadvantage consumers by pushing up prices and reducing the amount and quality of services.
卖给私人投资者的公共事业确实可能会提高这些实体的盈利导向，但这一定是好事吗？私营企业关心的是他们的所有者的利益。公共部门机构的创建正是为了避免这种情况，他们应该为公众的利益工作。众所周知，市场无法有效管理每个人都可以轻易从中受益的商品及公共商品，如环境、教育和公共基础设施，如公园、道路和邮政服务。私人所有者不会投入社会效益高的资金。这种市场失败就是公共商品通常由政府掌握的原因。这也适用于只能维持少数公司的自然垄断行业。将他们的运营交给私营部门将导致垄断，通过提高价格和降低服务的数量和质量来损害消费者。
Japan introduced a publicly owned postal service because it is beneficial for society if the post office services all regions, even remote ones, at the same price. To boost profits, a privatized postal service will no doubt close a large number of offices. Prices of all postal services are likely to rise, while many unprofitable but convenient services are likely to be canceled. Transaction costs for the general public will increase. What is efficient for the new private owners will in part be inefficient for the public. As a result, privatization will most likely shift money from the pockets of ordinary citizens into those of the new shareholders.
日本引入了公有邮政服务，因为如果邮局服务所有地区，甚至偏远地区都以相同的价格，对社会是有益的。为了提高利润，私有化的邮政服务无疑会关闭大量的办公室。 所有邮政服务的价格可能会上涨，而许多不盈利但方便的服务可能会被取消。公众的交易成本将增加。对新的私人所有者来说，有效的部分对公众来说可能是无效的。因此，私有化最可能将钱从普通公民的口袋转移到新股东的口袋。
The same applies to education, which is the foundation of economic development in any country. To boost Japan's long-term growth rate and benefit the majority of the public, Japan created public schools and universities, which have very low fees. The highest overall level of education can be achieved in an open, merit-based educational system that offers equal opportunities for everyone, no matter how wealthy one's parents are. This has been one of the pillars of the successful egalitarian, classless societies that boast high standards of living, such as Sweden, Germany, Japan, and other Asian countries.
同样的道理也适用于教育，这是任何国家经济发展的基础。为了提高日本的长期增长率，并使大多数公众受益，日本创建了公立学校和大学，这些学校的费用非常低。最高的教育水平可以在一个开放的、基于优秀的教育系统中实现。这个系统为每个人提供了平等的机会，无论他们的父母有多富有。这一点一直是成功的、平等的、无阶级社会的支柱之一。这些社会拥有高生活水平，如瑞典、德国、日本和其他亚洲国家。
Koizumi is now proposing to move Japan more in the direction of Britain, where the educational system has not adequately dealt with the bias against the less well-off, and where the privatization of public corporations has not visibly worked in the interest of consumers and the general public. 15.
小泉纯一郎现在提议让日本更多地走向英国的方向，那里的教育系统没有妥善处理对较差的人的偏见，公共公司的私有化也没有明显的为消费者和公众的利益工作。失误。
A lingering worry is that public institutions do not motivate their staff properly, which privatization could change. Indeed, if there is underperformance, something should be done about it. But the performance of staff can be increased by implementing the right incentive structures without changing ownership. Apart from the ownership, the differences between public and private bureaucracies are in any case small. Large firms are in their structure similar to civil service bureaucracies.
一个持续的担忧是，公共机构没有适当的激励他们的员工，而私有化可能会改变这一点。确实，如果存在表现不佳的情况，应该对此采取行动。但是，通过实施正确的激励结构，可以提高员工的表现，而无需改变所有权。除了所有权，公共和私人官僚机构之间的差异在任何情况下都很小。大公司在结构上类似于公务员官僚机构。
The end does not justify the means.
目的不成为手段的合理化。
We have examined the case that, perhaps, the Bank of Japan's means to achieve its end could be justified by the positive nature of that end. However, this argument does not hold. There is therefore no good economic rationale for pursuing the types of policies that the Bank of Japan has pursued over the past decades. This leaves us with the fact that the decision on structural reform is ultimately a political one. Irrespective of the ultimate goal, the question here is whether the implementation of a long-term structural change agenda that affects income and wealth distribution, social and economic institutions, and society in general is really the task of unelected central bankers. Nothing in the Bank of Japan law, old or new, has ever awarded the central bank such a mandate. In Posen's words, no Japanese citizen elected the BOJ to pursue this policy of promoting restructuring, and in fact no elected official delegated this task to the BOJ or put the goal of encouraging creative destruction into its mandate. 16 To create public consensus on the need for structural reform by purposely creating a recession must constitute an abuse of power. 17.
我们已经审查了这样一个案例，也许日本银行实现其目标的手段可以通过该目标的积极性质来证明。然而，这个论点并不成立。因此，过去几十年来，日本银行所追求的政策类型没有好的经济理由。这使我们面临这样一个事实，即结构改革的决定最终是一个政治问题。无论最终目标如何，这里的问题是实施影响收入和财富分配、社会和经济机构以及整个社会的长期结构变革议程是否真的是非选举中央银行家的任务。在日本银行法，无论是旧的还是新的，都从未授予中央银行这样的任务。用波森的话说， 没有日本公民选举日本银行来推动这种促进重组的政策。事实上，没有任何选举官员将这项任务委托给日本银行，或者将鼓励创新破坏的目标纳入其任务。16通过故意制造经济衰退来在公众中形成对需要进行结构改革的共识，必须构成滥用权力。17